There is a moment out on the open water when even a strong ship sounds afraid. The wind drops, the sails go slack, the sea turns into hammered metal, flat and watchful. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a convoy moves like a floating city. Towering hulls, guarded decks, armed men, and the weight of empire sealed inside chests below. If you were standing there breathing salt and tar, you would not call it a target. You would call it impossible. And yet, in the late 17th century, a single English pirate did exactly that. He reached out into the Indian Ocean, seized a Mughal treasure ship, and then, when the world rose up to punish him, he did the one thing pirates are not supposed to do: he disappeared. Not in a blaze of cannon smoke, not on a gallows, not in a final battle worth a ballad. He simply stepped into the crowd of the world and was never properly seen again. That is the hook people remember. But it is not the whole trap. Because the real story is not only about how Henry Avery took the greatest prize of his age, it is about what that prize did to everyone who touched it. How one raid could shake courts, choke trade, and force a corporation to behave like a state. And why the treasure, for all its glitter, may have been the very thing that made him impossible to find. The Indian Ocean in those days was not empty water between continents. It was a road. And the road had rules: winds that arrived with the monsoon, ports that rose and fell on merchants' trust, and currents that pulled ships into their fates with the patience of a predator. On one shore stood the Mughal Empire, immense and wealthy, able to move riches across land and sea with the confidence of a power that believed itself permanent. On another stood the English East India Company, private in name, imperial in practice, fighting to convince India and Europe that English trade was orderly, disciplined, and worth relying on. That is why this raid mattered. Piracy is not only theft, it is a public announcement that order is negotiable. And when that announcement is made against a ship tied to Mughal wealth and honour, the answer is never small. Henry Avery began far from the glowing centre of legend. The records that survive suggest a working sailor's life: hard labour, uncertain pay, discipline enforced with rope and fist, and long stretches of boredom punctuated by fear. In that world, a man's loyalty could be purchased, but it could also be exhausted. Then came the mutiny. Accounts place Avery aboard a ship called the Charles II with poor morale and unpaid men in the spring of 1694. The details vary depending on the source, but the shape of the event is familiar to anyone who knows the sea. The point where hunger and resentment become a vote. Captain out, new captain in. And the ship remade, not just in command but in purpose. Records describe the ship being renamed the Fancy Ark, an almost mocking name for something that was about to become a weapon. A mutiny is a crime, but it is also a birth. The old life ends, a new one begins with no lawful path back. And in that new life, speed is survival. A pirate captain cannot linger. Every port is a net. Every island has ears. So Avery does what successful outlaws always do. He leans into motion. He sails into the great ocean lanes where the world's wealth travels, and where ships vanish often enough that a man can still believe in luck. Luck, at first, seems to favour him. And then someone whispers the name of a prize so obscene that it turns experienced pirates into gamblers. A Mughal convoy. The story often centres on the ship called the Ganj-i-Sawai, sometimes spelled differently in English sources, described as an armed Mughal vessel captured by Avery in September 1695 while sailing from the region of Mocha towards Surat. Even this simple sentence contains the ingredients of catastrophe: the corridor between the Red Sea and India, the presence of treasure, and the collision of violence with imperial dignity. Mocha was more than a name in a sailor's mouth. It was a port of heat and stone and trade, a place where the smell of coffee and sweat and seawater clung to everything. It sat on the edge of the Red Sea world, a hinge between empires and merchants, and ships came and went there under the gaze of officials who understood exactly what wealth looked like when it was packed into crates. Surat on India's western coast was another kind of hinge, one of the great arteries of Indian Ocean commerce, and a place where the East India Company depended on permission, not force. A single mistake there could close doors that money could not reopen. This is the part most pirate tales smooth over. Pirates are often described as if they operate outside systems. They do not. They operate inside the cracks of systems. They thrive because trade creates predictable routes, and predictable routes create ambush points. They thrive because officials can be bribed, because governors can be persuaded, because paper can be forged, because harbours can be bought for one night. Henry Avery's rise is not only a rise of violence, it is a rise of understanding. He understands that the sea is wide, but human nature is narrow. A ship loaded with treasure will behave like treasure. It will take the shortest route, it will seek safety, it will depend on escorts, it will trust its own strength. And when pirates gather, it is rarely because they love each other, it is because the prize is too large for one ship to take alone. So the pirate world does what it always does when the stakes become mythical. It assembles, temporarily, into something like an army. Captains with separate ambitions align for a few weeks because the sea has offered them a single throw of the dice. Imagine the days before contact, the slow stalking on the horizon, the men sleeping in their clothes, the decks greasy with seawater and gun oil, the constant creak of timber as the ship rides its own impatience, the way every distant sail becomes a question, and then, finally, the moment the convoy appears, multiple hulls spread like a moving archipelago. It is one thing to rob a merchantman, it is another to reach toward a formation that represents an empire's confidence, because what you are really doing is daring that empire to answer you. The capture itself is described in sources that try to pin down the date and the principal ship, but the finer details, exact maneuvers, exact sequence, the chaos of the engagement shift between accounts. That is normal for sea battles. Water swallows certainty. Records are written after the fact, often by men who had reasons to shape the story. What does not shift is the outcome. Avery's pirates take the Ganj-i-Sawai, and they take a staggering quantity of wealth. Historians and popular retellings alike call it one of the most lucrative pirate raids in recorded history. And then comes the moment that turns a raid into a crisis. Because the sea is not only a place of capture, it is a place of aftermath. Now the pirates have a problem that is almost worse than the hunt. They have too much. Too much gold to spend without questions, too much silver to move without attracting attention, too many jewels that cannot be explained by any honest life, too much sudden change for a man to hide inside the ordinary world. Treasure is supposed to be freedom. In reality, treasure is exposure. The larger the prize, the more people must know about it for it to become useful. Fences, merchants, corrupt officials, sailors willing to carry messages, tavern keepers willing to look the other way. Each person is a leak. Each leak is a chance for the world to build a trail. This is where the legend usually insists on romance. Buried chests, secret islands, a pirate king vanishing into palm shadows. But the more convincing reality is colder. The treasure is divided. It has to be. A pirate crew is not a family, it is an agreement held together by greed and fear. If Avery tries to hoard too much, he risks mutiny, because mutiny is how he became captain in the first place. The same logic that lifted him can destroy him. So the wealth fractures into shares, and the shares fracture into smaller deals. Coins become bribes, gems become silence, silver becomes passage on other ships. And then the pirates do what pirates always do when they want to stop being pirates. They look for a place to become ghosts. In the Atlantic world, the Bahamas and New Providence enter the story as a kind of refuge, a place where governance could be thin and officials could be flexible, at least for a time. Later writing describes Avery bribing his way into safety there, trying to transform sea theft into shore life. But a refuge is only a refuge until someone powerful decides it is a nest. And now across the world, people are deciding exactly that. Back in Mughal territory, the seizure of the ship is not simply an economic loss, it is an insult with political weight. It suggests weakness on routes tied to commerce and pilgrimage. It suggests that Englishmen, whether pirates or merchants, can strike and then vanish without consequence. That kind of suggestion can harden quickly into policy. For the English East India Company, this is a nightmare scenario. The company's entire position depends on continued access, continued permissions, continued trust. If Mughal authorities choose to retaliate against English trade broadly, company men can be imprisoned, property seized, ports closed, and the company cannot simply declare, "That was not us," and expect the sea to care. So the response begins. Rewards are offered, names are circulated, pressure is applied across ports. The machinery of law, slow but persistent, turns its gaze outward. This is why some writers describe the pursuit of Avery as an early global manhunt in spirit, because the chase is not confined to one coast or one court. It spreads along the same trade arteries the pirates used, through the same ports they bribed, across the same networks of rumour that carried the first news of the raid. And the hunt does catch some. Records indicate that while Avery himself vanishes, some of his crew do not. Men are arrested, some are executed, their bodies become a message, the old language of empire, proof that the rope still waits at the end of the sea road. But the man at the centre of the story, Avery, does not appear at the end of that rope. Instead, his life becomes a corridor of shadows. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Henry Avery story is how quickly the historical record thins. You can point to the mutiny, you can point to the raid, you can point to the political crisis and the captures that followed. And then, where you expect the final chapter, you find fog. Later accounts place him in different places. Some stories have him travelling under false names. Some suggest he reached Ireland in 1696. Some imply he died poor, swallowed by the very world he tried to buy his way into. Accounts differ, and that uncertainty is not a flaw in the story, it is the story. Because disappearance is not a single act, it is a sustained performance. To vanish, you must stop being yourself in public. You must become boring. You must develop an appetite for smallness. You must resist the urge to tell the truth when someone buys you ale and asks where you got your money. And you must accept that you can never fully enjoy what you stole. This is the turn in the tale, the first crack that dooms everything. The treasure is supposed to end the chase. Instead, it begins it. Avery's raid does not make him free, it makes him famous. And fame, in an age of proclamations and pamphlets, can travel as fast as ships. The more authorities advertise their desire to catch him, the more they carve his name into public imagination. The legend becomes a kind of smoke signal. Henry Avery, the pirate who took the Mughal treasure ship. If he spends too boldly, he is seen. If he lives too quietly, he becomes restless. If he returns to the sea, he becomes a target. If he stays on land, he becomes a question. So what does a hunted man do when he has too much wealth to explain and too much fear to sleep? He breaks the treasure apart until it no longer looks like treasure. A coin disappears easily, a chest does not. A handful of gems can be passed between hands, a fortune cannot. This is why the missing treasure may not be missing in the way people want it to be. It may not be sitting intact beneath sand. It may be scattered, spent, laundered, traded into property, bribed into safety, converted into anonymity. The treasure disappears because it becomes ordinary again, one transaction at a time. And yet even that isn't enough to satisfy the hunger the story creates, because a pirate story at its core is a story about endings. We want the ending to prove something, that the world is just, or that the world is cruel, or that freedom is possible. Henry Avery refuses to provide that proof. He slips out of the record, and so the record fills with invention. Some of that invention is glamorous, some is moralistic, some is simply desperate to close the loop. But the simplest explanation is also the most haunting. The 17th century was full of people who disappeared, not because they were brilliant, but because systems were porous and identities were flexible. A man could travel, adopt an alias, and live out his days in a coastal town where no one cared about his past as long as he paid his bills. The sea did not just create pirates, it created anonymity. And in that anonymity, the greatest prize ever stolen could dissolve like salt in water. That is the fall, not of a ship, but of a life. Every success triggers consequences beyond his own fate. The East India Company, forced into damage control, faces the reality that it must police not only its enemies, but its own countrymen. The company's credibility becomes a strategic asset. The company's promises become a form of currency. One pirate raid becomes a lesson in how fragile commercial empires really are. And for piracy itself, the raid becomes a peak, an event so lucrative that it draws new men toward the black flag, convinced they too can seize one perfect prize and then vanish. But most cannot. Most pirates in the end do not become ghosts, they become examples. That is why Henry Avery lingers, not because piracy was unique to him, but because escape was. He is the pirate who seems to have stepped off the world's edge while carrying a fortune that should have anchored him to every rumor, every bribe, every betrayal. So where did the treasure go? The honest answer is that no single document, no single wreck, no single buried chest can safely close the case. The best sources speak in careful tones. The raid happened, the prize was immense, the consequences were global, and Avery's final fate remains uncertain. But that uncertainty is exactly why the story endures. Because the sea is the perfect accomplice, it keeps no ledger, it forgets footprints, it swallows names. And somewhere in the imagination of every sailor who ever stared into the horizon and wondered what lay beyond, there is still a ship moving through quiet waters, heavy with stolen gold, and a man at the rail whose face we cannot quite see. Maybe he lived rich, maybe he died poor, maybe he was betrayed by the very systems he tried to buy, maybe he survived by becoming smaller than the story. All we can say with confidence is that the treasure did not only vanish into sand or sea, it vanished into people, into bribes and bargains and ordinary lives that never wrote down where the money came from. It vanished into the great crowd of the world until it became impossible to separate stolen wealth from the endless flow of wealth itself. And that is the most unsettling truth behind Henry Avery. The greatest pirate prize in history may have disappeared not through perfect hiding, but through perfect scattering. The wind rises again, the sails fill, the ship creaks and moves forward, and the ocean, indifferent as ever, carries its secrets on the surface and keeps its answers in the deep. If you want more true stories from the age of piracy, where empires met the sea and paid for it in silence, subscribe and sail with us again.